The fall of empires in history. Throughout history, empires have risen with thunder and fallen in silence. From the majestic palaces of Rome to the golden sands of the Abbasid Caliphate, from the disciplined legions of the Qin dynasty to the vast colonial reach of the British Empire. Each once seemed invincible. But power is fragile, and history is merciless. Behind every collapse lies a complex web of internal decay, external pressure, betrayal, ambition, and hubris. The fall of an empire is rarely a single event. It is a slow unraveling, a gradual erosion of authority, belief, and unity. In their ruins, we find echoes of human greatness and warnings for the future. Why did the Spanish Empire collapse? The Spanish Empire, also known throughout history as the Hispanic monarchy, was at one time one of the largest empires to ever exist. The Spanish Empire was fairly unique in its structure, and it boasted colonial overseas territories across the Americas, Asia, Africa, and Oceania. During its peak, the monarchy even became known as the empire on which the sun never sets. So, how did a powerful force, such as the Spanish Empire, collapse after centuries of dominating land around the globe? The creation of this monarchy may have foreshadowed its later decline into extinction. In 1469, Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile married. Despite coming from modest backgrounds that forced the young couple to use loans simply in order to afford their wedding ceremony, overcoming the obstacle of finances that would later plague and doom their now budding empire, the 18- and 17-year-old monarchs' union marked an important pillar for the foundation of the Spanish monarchy. While the marriage formed a personal union between Aragon and Castile and united the economic, religious, and military aspects of their joined Iberian territory, it did not form a totally unitary style of authority, spanning over all of the empire's claimed possessions. In fact, the monarchy did not fully take on the structure of an empire until the Spanish Habsburgs came to power at the start of the 16th century, and this formation was further solidified by the Spanish Bourbon rulers later on. The monarchy under Ferdinand and Isabella was fairly admirable and a solid start for the new formed union. Many governmental reforms, such as the judicial system and tax administration, brought about remarkable improvements, as did the abolishment of serfdom, updated infrastructure, and other changes made by the young leaders. This foundation was not as bad as one might expect from an empire that collapsed as the Spanish did. Nevertheless, the decay of the large European power began long before the inevitable fall itself. The main problems were the poor decisions made by Spanish governments during the decades. Spain was a global superpower, and as other big empires, the external threat wasn't the main issue. In a case of military defeat, such an empire will not crumble if everything was in order at home. The biggest problem for the Spanish Empire started from within. Around the middle of the 16th century, Spain's economy at home was starting to struggle. Overseas, in contrast, the empire was still on a wave of vast expansion, and had not yet hit a rut in that regard. Still, back in Europe, things were not going so well. Expansion-wise, the empire was doing quite all right. With Charles V seizing the throne, the empire was technically expanded without the use of military conquest over southern Italy, Austria, the Netherlands, and the Holy Roman Empire. But yet, somehow, despite this superficial success, The economy was in a decline. One theory as to why this odd contradiction existed lies in the laid-back approach that the empire took in managing its overseas possessions. While the new colonial territories of the Spanish Empire provided new opportunities for the exploitation of natural resources and for trade around the world, the empire was lax with its subjects and did not ask for much. What they did ask for, such as a share of their colony's mining earnings, in addition, was often withheld. Furthermore, the Habsburgs had hoped to maintain a state monopoly and closed mercantile system, but more or less failed. Instead, they set up their empire for economic hardship. In an attempt to counteract their rapid fall behind the industrial and economic progress of their Dutch, English, and French European neighbors, the Spanish Empire began to allow and almost embrace illicit commercial activity that had any potential to bring in money for the crown. During the reign of Charles V, military conflict with France, the Ottomans and German states drained the Spanish fund drastically. The emperor became desperate, having to take loans from German and Genoese banks, meanwhile hoping to tax his subjects more to try and recover the lost finances. While he originally turned to the Netherlands and Italy with these taxes, he was unable to maintain them for long, and eventually had to target Spain itself. This caused more damage at home, as Spain's taxes were hiked, and Castile took the brunt of it. Part of this new tax structure included the alcabala, which differed from a normal sales tax, as it could be applied to any transaction at any point in the process of a product moving to market and afterward. It also put a 10% tax on the transfer of all property, personal or otherwise, and all assets. The system was self-destructive, and many notable figures within the empire, such as Cardinal Ximenes, even attempted to convince Emperor Charles to remove the harmful taxation. But due to the revenue it brought in, the monarch refused, and even added more taxes, including the cruzada, the terces, and the servicio. This plan began to implode on itself, as the increased taxes also sparked an increase in tax evasion. Some tax gatherers would even be murdered, while other citizens simply found more subtle means of avoiding payment. Many farmers began to emigrate to the Americas in a desperate attempt to avoid the draining taxes. Others realized that government employees were free of taxes, which caused a skyrocket in the number of such workers. One Spaniard even wrote that there were 1,000 employees where 40 would suffice. Noblemen were also exempt from many taxes, prompting other desperate peasants to join their more underground lifestyle. By the end of Charles' time as emperor, the region of Aragon, in particular, was actually paying fewer taxes than it had before the new system was implemented, as if this new predicament wasn't enough to shake the empire's foundation. The Spanish monarchs were now also faced with the challenge of a Dutch revolt in their Netherland colony. The Dutch were furious with the Spanish Empire for neglecting both their needs and problems, and for implementing some of the new damaging taxes from Spain, now in the Netherlands as well. In addition, there was the factor of rising Protestantism, particularly Calvinism, in the Netherlands region, that directly conflicted with the Spaniards' strong Catholicism. This revolt sparked a war not just between the Dutch and the Spanish, but even more so between the Spanish and the French, who were eager to join anyone in a campaign against Spain. This war was expensive and long-lasting. The Dutch did gain full autonomy from the Spanish Empire in 1581 as the Dutch Republic, but conflict between the now competing powers continued deep into the 17th century. As taxes continued to rise, so did tensions and dissatisfaction within the empire. In 1640, Portugal, which had only been united with Spain in 1580, erupted into rebellion and eventually declared its own independence from the Spanish Empire. This jolted the European holdings of the Spaniards, and many more of their semi-autonomous territories began threatening their own revolts, and some regions throughout Italy, Flanders, and France even broke free, adding fuel to the already raging fire. The new issuance of copper coins triggered inflation in 1641, which was counteracted with a messy anti-inflationary reform the following year. At this time, as stated by a French envoy to Spain, it would be difficult to describe to its full extent the disorder in the government of Spain. By the 18th century, the Bourbon monarchs, who replaced the Habsburgs when they were unable to produce another heir, attempted to mend the issues arising within their empire. But they were undermined by their own thirst for war and further expansion. At this point, Protestantism was spreading like wildfire, and the Spaniards were inspired to fight back in the name of Catholicism, as well as feeling compelled to directly oppose the Ottoman Empire's advances, as they too hoped to expand their influence. This uptick in warfare cost money, and the Spanish Empire lacked a surplus of finances. Hoping to counteract this problem, the Bourbon monarchs aimed to re-establish a Spanish monopoly, as had been attempted before, but they were stopped by the terms of the Treaty of Utrecht in 1713, which ended the War of Spanish Succession. The empire tried to offset this blockade by rolling out strict new trade and commerce reforms, both at home and overseas, which eventually sparked a war with the British in the late 1700s. Demonstrating the never-ending chaos that had been created. Some local political writers even recognized the growing monetary problems and sent letters to the crown, suggesting that royal expenditure must be regulated, the sale of office halted, the growth of the church checked, the tax system must be overhauled, special concessions must be made to agricultural laborers, rivers be made navigable, and dry lands irrigated. Furthermore, the authors even pointed out directly the empire's humiliating dependence on foreign nations. But it was too late. Because of these internal problems, the territories of the Americas were pretty much neglected, as they were a very good stream of gold and silver, and not a territory to be more populated and incorporated more under Spanish authority. The Spanish administration in the Americas was inferior to the English administration, as the new English and later British territories had a rapid growth in population due to liberal immigration policies attracting large proportions of German and French people. Meanwhile, the Spanish territories had a slow growth due to greater emphasis on military conquest, many early failures to establish permanent settlements, and poor relations with Native Americans. At the start of the 19th century, Napoleonic France invaded Spain, and this was the fire that sparked the revolutions in the Americas. The other viceroyalties rebelled, as their home nation was too weak to have the reins, and it was clear that Spain was just a shadow of its former self. The revolutions had success, and it was clear that Spain wasn't able to fight them. In just a few years, they lost almost all of their American possessions, and at the end of the 19th century, after the Spanish-American War, they lost Cuba, Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines, marking the official end of the empire. The sole reason for the collapse of the Spanish Empire was essentially ill management by the monarchs, and possibly overconfidence of their ability to maintain stable colonial territories. In less simple terms, money or lack thereof and poor judgment played a hugely significant role in the humiliating fall of an empire with so much potential at its start. Still, finances were not on the side of the Spaniards, and it seems that, somehow, the foreshadowing of Ferdinand and Isabella's wedding, would come to life in spite of every overcome it. Why did the Swedish Empire collapse? Across the European continent, many fantastic imperial powers have left their footprint on their own soil and abroad. But one European empire that tends to deserve more credit than it's often given was the mighty empire of Sweden. The Swedish Empire is generally said to have started with the reign of Gustavus Adolphus in the early 17th century, and is usually believed to have ended roughly a century later with the Great Northern War and its aftermath. This sadly means that the imperial might of Sweden was short-lived in comparison to other empires in the region, but nonetheless, it still existed for the reign of multiple monarchs and was far from being irrelevant in its day. So what happened with the Swedish Empire? Was it ended by war, economic strife, poor leadership, or something else? Well, let's take a look. Throughout history, intelligence and espionage have been very important elements when one kingdom or empire tried to conquer another. Even though these old methods have disappeared, today's world has brought new possibilities to compromise our digital security through the internet. But you can protect your personal information using NordVPN. They offer you multiple benefits like internet freedom, offering 100 secure servers in 60 countries, protection against malware, online privacy, the ability to use up to 6 devices for one subscription, and other layers of protection. So, if you want private, fast, and secure internet access, NordVPN is for you. You can support our channel by visiting nordvpn.com/nalagiavpn to get a great discount of the 2-year plan and 1 additional month for free with no risk to you. Considering that NordVPN offers a 30-day money-back guarantee. Before the reign of Gustavus Adolphus came that of King Gustav Vasa, who would solidify his place in Swedish history through his sweeping efforts to reform the Swedish state over his 37-year rule, and would lead Sweden into its role as a prominent state in the newly incited Protestant Reformation. By the time Gustavus Adolphus claims the throne, this strong Protestant conviction in Sweden dragged the kingdom into the 30 Years' War with the Catholics of the Holy Roman Empire. It was this war that resulted in the gaining of new territory for Sweden throughout the dominion of the Holy Roman Empire, and coincided with Swedish colonial efforts in both West Africa and North America, which meant a sudden increase in Sweden's global influence over only a few decades. Sweden was suddenly turning itself into an empire. And at first, it was going quite well. Problems within Imperial Sweden were not slow to arrive, nevertheless. Following the reign of Gustavus Adolphus came the ill-liked rule of his daughter Christina. The new queen was a very intelligent woman, but she was also a woman who much enjoyed a bit of extravagance. Her spending was viewed by the public as unappealing, and eventually became so much so that she nearly drove the state into bankruptcy. Public disapproval ultimately reached an all-time high and pushed Christina into her abdication, at which point the throne was taken over by her cousin, Charles Gustav, in 1654. Charles was a markedly better ruler in the eyes of the public, and they quickly looked to him to mend the state's issues, ranging from finances to relations with the people and the nobility. To solve the financial problem and tackle the whopping national debt, Charles decided to address an ongoing issue relating to alienated crown lands and taxes on the nobility in a process known as the reduction. Meanwhile, Charles, who had been first and foremost a soldier, decided to put added effort into military action and gaining glory on behalf of himself and Sweden, which prompted mixed reactions as he decided to attack the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth early into his reign. The subsequent Polish-Sweden wars were not necessarily a failure, but they weren't quite what the nation needed. Charles' personal reputation and success grew as a result. But the warfare didn't solve Sweden's financial and political issues back home, which would continue into the reign of his successor, Charles XI. Technically, Charles XI was only 4 years old at the time of his ascension, so a regency council was put in place to actually run the empire until he came of age. During the time of his childhood, the Regency Council hopes to end the ongoing wars not only with Poland, but also with Russia, the electorate of Brandenburg, and their longtime rival of Denmark-Norway. In an immediate effort to do this, the Treaty of Olivia was signed in the spring of 1660 by the Swedish Empire, the Holy Roman Empire, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, and Brandenburg, Prussia, to end the chronic hostilities and resolve some of the remaining territorial and political discord between the states, encouraged by the peace talks. Denmark-Norway then opted to open their own negotiations with Sweden, and the Treaty of Copenhagen was signed shortly after. Lastly, the following year, hostilities were put to an end with the Tsardom of Russia after the Russo-Swedish War had ended in 1658, which more or less put an end to all discontent and conflict between the Swedes and their neighbors. Peace had come at a price, and a dwindling passion for upholding Protestantism within their realm was also earning the Swedes a new wave of enemies from the inside. Only about half a century into its existence, the Swedish Empire had already nearly gone bankrupt, suffered from abdication from one of its monarchs, juggled multiple wars at once, and was now struggling to build up national confidence. Sweden became notoriously corrupt, and its loyalty was buyable, something that France took quick advantage of. By 1675, France had convinced the Swedish Empire to invade the electorate of Brandenburg, which resulted in an embarrassing defeat for the Swedish army and greatly emboldened their other rivals, leading to the Scanian War. This marks the point in time where the trajectory of the Swedish Empire quickly pitched downhill. Brandenburg, Denmark, Norway, and Austria all began to capture more of Sweden's territories, and the new war went fairly poorly for the Swedes. But they were able to maintain a certain level of success militarily within their own borders. And thanks to the alliance with France, the resulting treaties restored Sweden's lost territories. Charles XI, now governing of his own accord, opted for sweeping reforms in response to the war, then shifting the empire into a semi-absolute monarchy, which actually went over quite well with the people. He was also able to rebuild the Swedish Royal Navy, which had been essentially demolished in the recent war, and used additional reforms to improve the military as a whole. It seems that the Swedish Empire would be saved, thanks to Charles XI, but his death would mark the continuation of the imperial power's rapid downhill tumble. The next king, Charles XII, would be left in a precarious position when, in 1700, Sweden's off-and-on rivals in Denmark-Norway, Russia and Poland simultaneously declared war, and the years to follow were a bit chaotic. Poland and Denmark were in and out of the war, and Sweden did well against Russia with the help of some allies. But Russia was eventually able to capture what is modern-day Finland. Charles XII's death in battle in 1718 would mostly put an end to Sweden's defense efforts and its time as a global power. Now, Sweden remained a relevant regional authority, but its time as an empire was all but over, despite the dedicated efforts from Charles XII and his father to save their imperial state. Unfortunately for the Swedes, The empire never had a strong foundation. Its early years were respectable enough. But the reign of Christina brought in fresh skepticism and distrust from the people, massive financial burdens, and the early inklings of governmental corruption. Her abdication was good in the short term, but set an unsavory tone in the long run, as it marked the shortcomings so early into the empire's existence. Her successor was an improvement, and surely a brave soldier, but not enough was accomplished by him to make up for the damage she had done. Over the next few reigns, a common thread of disorganization, instability, and a growing list of enemies made it incredibly challenging for Sweden to make any significant progress. War was financially taxing and worked to isolate the young empire, which pushed Sweden from one issue to another, whether it be internal conflict over which wars should and shouldn't be fought, or the growing displeasure from the people due to the corruption and willingness by the government to be bought as an ally to those who would take them. Still, the last two kings put in a fair effort to save their crumbling empire, but it ultimately would not be enough. The momentum had already begun, and was impossible to stop. So, the reason why the Swedish Empire quietly collapsed after a short century is due both to external pressures, but also, and maybe more importantly, due to internal instability and a shaky foundation from the beginning. Unfortunate circumstances combined with just as unfortunate decisions led to the empire never having a chance to get its head on straight and eventually brought about its untimely demise. Why did the Dutch Empire collapse? The territories that would later form the Dutch Republic began as a loose federation, known as the 17 Provinces, which Charles the Holy Roman Emperor, also named Charles I of Spain, inherited and brought under his direct rule in 1543. In 1566, a Protestant Dutch revolt broke out against rule by Roman Catholic Spain, sparking the 80 Years' War. During and after this conflict, the Dutch will focus on creating colonies and trading posts around the world. In Europe, trade was more and more important since the exploration era started. Ports and coastal cities were vital for economy and for cash flow. One of Europe's most important commercial cities was Amsterdam. The city became a true center for trading, shipping, and commerce. Efficient access to capital enabled the Dutch in the 1580s to extend their trade routes beyond northern Europe to new markets in the Mediterranean and Levant. At the end of the 16th century, their ships started to trade with the new discovered lands: Brazil, Dutch Gold Coast of Africa, and Asian islands were important commercial targets. This brought the Dutch into direct competition with Portugal, which had dominated these trade routes for several decades and had established colonial outposts on the coasts of Brazil, Africa, and the Indian Ocean, and Hoots. From this time, the Dutch started to have small colonies, plantations, and trade posts around the world, in North and South America, in Africa and Asia. The Spanish-Dutch War was for the Dutch part of their struggle for independence during the 80 Years' War. Because there was a union called the Iberian Union between Portugal and Spain, the enemies of Spain became the enemies of Portugal too. The Dutch attacked their colonies, especially the important trade network around Asian islands, India, Africa, and South America. By doing so, the Dutch became a colonial nation. In the summer of 1629, the Dutch had a newfound interest in rich sugar plantations, so they wanted to obtain the Brazilian state of Pernambuco, the largest and richest sugar production area. The Dutch sent a fleet of 65 ships. They managed to get it, and the Dutch Brazil was also known as New Holland, and it was the northern portion of the Portuguese colony of Brazil, ruled by the Dutch during the Dutch colonization of the Americas between 1630 and 1654. In 1640, John the Duke of Braganza declared Portuguese independence from Spain. Brazil was originally, and had remained, a Portuguese colony. Some major uprising of Portuguese planters in June 1645. The Portuguese planters around Pernambuco had never fully accepted Dutch rule due to their different culture, language, and some taxes. And by doing so, the Dutch rule was abolished. Dutch provinces supported a larger expedition to reconquer Brazil, but was defeated by Portugal in the First and Second Battle of Guadalapes. The Dutch finally lost control of Recife on January 28, 1654, leaving to the Portuguese their colony of Brazil, and putting to an end this new Netherlands. In the next years, a Portuguese expedition had been sent from recaptured Brazil to conquer the taken colonies in Africa, across the Atlantic Ocean. The Dutch were expelled from Angola by 1648. This was about their loss in South America, more to the north. The Dutch managed to create a colony at the start of the 17th century in today's territory of the New York State. The West India Company created a settlement, established by the Company of New Netherland at Albany on the Hudson River. As the Portuguese, the Dutch focused a lot on trade, and they had been sending ships regularly to the Hudson River to trade fur, to protect their trade from French or English. A fortified town was founded in 1625 called New Amsterdam. In 1651, the Parliament of England passed first of the Navigation Acts. In these acts, they excluded Dutch shipping from the lucrative trade between England and its Caribbean colonies. These acts started a rivalry, and it led directly to more tension and then hostilities between the two countries. The Anglo-Dutch wars were a disadvantage for the Dutch and their naval and trade power. The Second Anglo-Dutch War started in 1665. The English forces moved to capture New Netherland, the important Dutch settlement in North America. The conflict lasted for 2 years, and it ended with the Treaty of Breda of 1667. The Act of Navigation was modified more in the favor of the Dutch. They would keep their valuable territories in Suriname. In exchange, New Netherland was ceded to England. Even if Dutch Republic would again take New Netherland in 1673 during the Third Anglo-Dutch War, it was returned to England the following year, ending their rule in North America, leaving behind a large Dutch community. In the same period, on the other side of the world, conflicts with Ming China existed, mainly due to trade reasons. Chinese General Zhang Zhenggong attacked and invaded Formosa. The Dutch defense, led by Governor Frederick Coyet, resisted against the Chinese for 9 months, but in the final, Fort Zeelandia surrendered, ending the Dutch rule in this territory. During the American for 9 months, but in the final, Fort Zeelandia surrendered, ending the Dutch rule in this territory. During the American Revolutionary War, Britain declared war on the Netherlands, the Fourth Anglo-Dutch War, in which Britain seized the Dutch colony of Ceylon. Under the Peace of Paris, 1783, Ceylon was returned to the Netherlands. In the middle of the 17th century, the Dutch managed to colonize territories in South Africa. In 1795, the French Revolutionary Army invaded the Dutch Republic and turned the nation into a satellite of France, named the Batavian Republic. Britain, which was at war with France, was now at war with the new Batavian Republic, and soon moved to occupy the Dutch colonies in Asia, South Africa, and the Caribbean. Under the terms of the Treaty of Amiens, signed by Britain and France in 1802, the Cape Colony and the islands of Dutch West Indies that the British had seized were returned to the Republic. Ceylon was not returned to the Dutch, and was made a British Crown colony. After 1 year, France and Britain will be at war again. The British retook the Cape Colony and also invaded and captured the island of Java in 1811. In 1806, Napoleon dissolved the Batavian Republic and established a new monarchy with his brother. Louis Bonaparte, on the throne as King of the Netherlands. Louis was removed from power by Napoleon in 1810, and the country was ruled directly from France until its liberation in 1813. The Napoleonic Wars created big losses for the Dutch. Being under the French rule in one way or another, some of their colonies were conquered. The Anglo-Dutch Treaty of 1814 will ratify that. Britain will get Cape Colony, Guyana, and Sri Lanka. Anglo-Dutch rivalry in Southeast Asia continued over the port of Singapore, which had been ceded to the British East India Company in 1819 by the Sultan of Johor. The Dutch claimed that a treaty signed with the Sultan's predecessor the year earlier had granted them control of the region. Again, tensions existed, and another Anglo-Dutch treaty was made in 1824. In this one, the Netherlands ceded Malacca and their bases in India to the British, and recognized the British claim to Singapore. In return, the British agreed not to sign the treaties with rulers in the islands south of the Straits of Singapore. After this treaty, in this part of the world, the islands were divided into two spheres of influence, a British one and a Dutch one. Netherlands will expand their possessions in East Indies, especially deep in their mainland, not only on the coast having control of what is now Indonesia. In 1942, the Empire of Japan invaded the Netherlands' East Indies, a territory rich in resources, vital for Japan at the time. The Japanese occupation of Indonesia during World War II encouraged the independence movement here. 2 days after the Japanese surrender in August 1945, some nationalists declared Indonesian independence. A 4.5-year struggle followed as the Dutch tried to re-establish their colony. Dutch forces reoccupied most of the colonial territory. As the decolonization movement started to rise, almost everywhere in the world, international opinion favored independence. In December 1949, the Netherlands formally recognized Indonesian sovereignty. The Dutch, as well as other European powers, focused on new discovered lands, and they managed to establish important colonies and to increase their trade and cash flow. As the Portuguese, even if they were a power, they didn't have the necessary manpower or resources to establish very large colonies, and instead they preferred small ones and trade posts in key positions. Even if this was a good strategy, in time, due to rivalries with stronger and bigger nations, some of their possessions were lost. And in the 20th century, other colonies got their independence due to the decolonization period, being encouraged by other powers. How did the Roman Empire start to collapse? The empire is starting to collapse. The hard-fought stability brought to the empire by Diocletian and Constantine the Great would not prove durable. While ensuring he had a viable dynasty to continue ruling following his death, Constantine's son would not operate with the same tact and strategy as their father. Beginning with the purging of perceived internal threats, including close family, it wouldn't be long until they turned on each other, bringing full-scale civil war back to Rome. Alongside the internal strife, the period would be characterized by continued European tribal threats, which were becoming difficult for the imperial machine to sustain battle against, as well as a continuation of the radical move towards Christianity as state religion begun under Constantine. Constantine the Great's long reign gave way to the co-rule of his three sons, with him investing his hopes for stability in a direct line of descendants sharing power. Given the length and impact of his reign, his sons were afforded legitimacy, and there was no effective challenge to their assumption of rule. The empire they inherited was a newly Christian one, still undergoing transformative changes from its pagan traditions to embrace the new religion. Threats on the borders also remained persistent, as they had for the past century or more now. Tribal invaders constantly pushing west from northern Germany down to the Adriatic, and the Sassanids, a growing menace once again. The period began with a bloody purge, instigated by Constantius, who ordered the killing of many male relatives who could pose a challenge to the son's power, 2 uncles, and several cousins in total. However, despite the attempts to smooth their path by the removal of potential challengers, the peace between the brothers wouldn't last long. By 340 AD, Constans and Constantine were battling in a civil war over Rome's western provinces, while Constantius governed over the east, where he was consumed by a war with King Shapur II of Persia. Constantine II was the loser of this conflict, killed near Aquileia, Italy, as he attempted to launch an invasion of the mainland to take territory from his brother. This would leave just Constans and Constantius, each governing half of the empire with an uneasy co-rule lasting through to 350 AD. For much of this time, Constantius was preoccupied with Sassanid incursions. Through the period, they would lay siege to a number of Roman cities in Mesopotamia with their fearsome war elephants and siege machinery. However, they remained unable to make key gains. Meanwhile, in Europe, Constans continued making war on the Germanic tribes, something he had been doing with success under the rule of his father, Constantine the Great, including against the Franks and Alemanni. There was division between the brothers in the 340s over their different interpretations of Christian orthodoxy during this still early phase of the established and centralized church. However, it wasn't until 350 AD that crisis would erupt again. Of the two brothers, it was Constans who seemingly lacked popularity. Salacious rumors of unknown veracity concerning his sexuality existed, as did his supposed habit of ignoring wise counsel. However, what is known is that a disgruntled general by the name of Magnentius attempted to usurp rule and declare himself emperor in eastern France. Shortly after, Constans was cornered by Magnentius's men in a fort in the Pyrenees and was killed by them after fleeing to the temple of Helena there. With the killing of Constans, Magnentius now tried to assert his legitimacy as emperor of the Western Empire. However, not from the Constantinian dynasty. It seems he struggled with this, and while attempting some reforms, his 3-year reign was defined by military encounters with Constantius and his armies of the Eastern Empire. Before we continue, I'd like to thank the sponsor of today's video, Surfshark. With so much of our communication and interactions taking place over the internet, it's more important than ever to protect your privacy and stay safe online. Luckily, Surfshark ensures that my data is safe and secure behind powerful encryption that hides my true IP. Additionally, Surfshark allows me to access content on platforms like Netflix that would otherwise be region-locked. By simply changing my virtual location, I can use Surfshark to access films and TV shows that aren't available where I am. Other Surfshark features like Clean Web also block ads, trackers, malware, and phishing attempts so you can browse safely. And tools like Alternative ID prevent your personal information from falling into the hands of data brokers and minimize the possibility of spam and annoying marketing emails. Surfshark has a 30-day money-back guarantee, so there's no risk in trying it out. Support our channel today by clicking our link in the description, or visit surfshark.com/NalagiaVPN to get 4 extra months on a 2-year plan. Constantius's eagerness to put down Magnentius was less to do with grief for his murdered brother, and more to do with seizing the opportunity for sole rule of the empire and putting down a threat. Despite Magnentius's initial attempts to appease Constantius, including the minting of him as superior on coinage, for example, the situation could not be allowed to go on. Constantius marched his legions west, with the two sides meeting in a major clash at the Battle of Mursa Major in modern-day Croatia. This was likely the largest Roman-on-Roman battle in the history of the empire, with as many as 60,000 men under Constantius and around 30,000 under Magnentius. Details of the course of the battle are scarce. But while Constantius came away the victor, losses on both sides were large, possibly as many as 48,000 casualties. This wasn't just a blow in the short term, leaving the empire weaker against the growing barbarian and Sassanid threats, but likely had repercussions on the rest of the history of the Western Empire. The replacement of that many men was a multi-generational project, which in this case, due to other future pressures, would never be completed. Following this defeat, Magnentius withdrew to northern Italy and towards his heartlands in Gaul. He was given a brief period of respite as Constantius refocused his attention on the Sarmatian tribal threat along the Danube in 352. But after achieving his aims, Constantius marched to meet Magnentius again. This time, he retreated to Gaul, where the two men would meet for the final time at the Battle of Mont-Saint-Lucas in southeastern France. This would be Magnentius' last stand. His reputation amongst his men and territories under his control was already severely weakened following the crushing defeat at Mursa Major, yet fate was not with him, and he suffered a defeat here again, thus ending his 3-year insurrection. Constantius was now sole ruler and had finally consolidated his rule. He wasn't to bask long in this complete power, though, and pragmatically appointed a Caesar below himself as Augustus around 355. This was a surprising decision for an emperor who had wiped out so many of his relatives, but it perhaps reflected the pressures the empire was under. The man he chose was Julian, who would serve in this role as ruler of the Western Empire for the remainder of Constantius's reign, tied by blood, which was ideal. Yet Julian had been immersed in academic pursuits in Athens and was young at 23 still. However, he adapted to the new demands of the role and his region of Gaul. Within a year, he was leading his first campaign with a task of pushing back Frankish marauders in the area of the Rhine. This he did with success. However, he then decided to spend the winter resting his men and withdrew to modern-day Verdun in France, dispersing troops around the area to try and solidify positions. By doing this, though, he left himself vulnerable. The Franks, ever mobile and hungry for battle, seized on this opportunity, besieging Julian and his reduced force size there. Things nearly ended badly, until relief came for him some months later. Not deterred by his close encounter at Verdun, the following year, in 357 AD, Julian embarked on a more significant campaign into the same territory. This time, a planned joint operation between himself and Augustus Constantius, with them pushing at the Germanic troops from different directions. As circumstances would have it, though, he would never join Constantius directly on this campaign. Forced to double back to defend Leon from a surprise attack by the Latii tribe, before being faced by King Cunodo Marius and a confederation of his Alemanni forces. The emerging Battle of Strasbourg between the two forces would be a decisive Roman victory, allowing for the repair of the defensive line along the Rhine and subjugation of the Alamae and other groups for a period. This was an epic meeting of the two forces. Julian's army, in the absence of Constantius's forces, likely stood at around 15,000, with the Alemanni coalition likely at around 20,000 to 25,000 strong. The Alemanni king, Cunodo Marius, had been sure to summon a strong army for this encounter against who he knew to be a capable leader. The Romans had a cavalry portion of around 20% of total troop numbers, including both lighter cavalry, ideal for harrying and routing, as well as horse archers and more heavily armed cataphract-style units. Both sides lined up to face each other, with the Alemanni having the advantage of dominating a slight hill. King Cunodo Marius had previously opted to remain detached from the battle, as Julian was behind Roman lines so as to be able to command more effectively, though apparently after a demand from the rank-and-file troops, he was obliged to lead the infantry lines on foot. This was an interesting reflection of differences between the sides and, ultimately, a reason Rome would always have the advantage with its more formal military approach and emphasis on sustained execution of drilled strategy. It is thought the battle began with a harrying approach from Roman light-mounted archers, carrying out a maneuver likely learned in previous decades in the Arab area of the empire and conflicts with the Parthians. They would approach Germanic lines close enough to fire off a volley before a rapid retreat. These waves would inflict heavy casualties as well as lure enemy infantry to break formation and pursue the archers. However, the bait wasn't taken, so Julian sent in heavy cataphract cavalry. These were elite units, well-versed in battling Germanic tribal groups. However, what they didn't know this time was that King Cunodo Marius had cunningly ordered an attachment of infantry to accompany his cavalry, so when the cataphract attack came, they could leap out from among their own cavalry, attacking the Roman units at close range and from below and amongst the melee, thus taking them down. This maneuver was pulled off with skill, sending the Roman cataphract units into a rout, a huge morale boost for the Alemanni troops to see these elite and feared Roman units fleeing from the battlefield. However, next came a mistake. The Germanic infantry, filled with enthusiasm, launched a headlong frontal assault into the tight Roman infantry formation. The interlocking wall of shields held strong against the Alemanni waves, the Germans unable to break the wall of thrusting spear and gladius. Despite eventually punching a hole through the Roman center, they were driven back by an elite Roman reserve line. By this time, exhausted from battle, as well as increasingly hemmed in an encircling Roman infantry, the Alemanni attempted to flee. It is thought that many thousands drowned trying to swim across the Rhine, with another 6,000 killed on the field of battle. These were comprehensive losses and would be enough to restore Roman dominance in the area for a period, as well as the previous defensive line which had fallen apart in previous decades. Despite these years of successful campaigns together and their blood ties, things would turn sour in the power-sharing agreement, this time while juggling threats at Rome's border between them. With Emperor Constantius faced with a renewed Sassanid threat in the east, he demanded half of Julian's troops from Gaul. This is a tall order for any commander, and it is thought that the insurrection originally began with the troops rather than Julian himself. However, he soon joined the insurrection and effectively mounted a challenge to Constantius' rule. By 361, Constantius moved to face him. However, he would not survive the journey, coming down with a bad fever and dying in early November. He apparently named Julian as his successor, which seems a strange move given the events at the time of his death. It may be a tweak of the historical record by his successor, or a strategic move given the events at the time of his death. It may be a tweak of the historical record by his successor, or a strategic move on the part of Constantius to choose the least worst option. As whilst Julian had essentially challenged his rule, he was still family and would at least keep the Constantian dynasty going. Among other aspects, Julian was a notable philosopher, having been liberally educated in the east of the empire for a long period in relation to other emperors of his time. He was also a follower of the empire's pagan traditions and keen to return Rome to its pre-Christian era. This is why he would come to be labeled in a somewhat derogatory way as Julian the Apostate. He had also proven himself in Rome's European provinces against the constant Germanic tribal threat. This was in both military and economic respects, as after succeeding in battle, he successfully restored the war-ravaged provinces to prosperity. His short reign, however, would come to an end in 363 AD, as he was killed while on campaign against the relentless Sassanids in the east. They now had the initiative in this theater, and before his death, realizing his army was low on provisions, had ordered the retreat of his troops towards Samara and Roman territory. However, his men were constantly harried by the Sassanids during their retreat, and it was during one of these encounters when Julian rode back to check on his last units facing Sassanid attack that he was mortally wounded, reportedly a spear which penetrated his lower intestine and liver as he had neglected to wear his armor in favor of speed. Jovian, his successor and part of Julian's elite bodyguard, came to power after a declaration by the troops. It was an inauspicious start to a doomed reign, though, as he was forced to resume Julian's retreat from the Sassanids on the day following his appointment. However, his army got stuck trying to cross the Tigris and was forced to agree to humiliating terms with the Sassanids just to allow his exhausted and undersupplied men to retreat. They were granted many concessions, and alongside his retreat, damaged his legitimacy. The remainder of his rule consisted almost solely of his march back towards Constantinople. He would never reach it, though, dying by what is thought was suffocation by assassin or accident in his tent. Following Jovian's death, Valentinian was chosen by a council from a selection of candidates and became emperor in February 364 AD. He quickly appointed his brother, Valens, as co-Augustus to rule over the east, like Constantius before him, possibly a recognition of the wide array of external challenges facing Rome, which were more than the capabilities of one ruler. Indeed, the issues facing Rome by this point were extensive. Almost constant war on the borders with the Sassanids and Germanic tribes had placed great strain on the economy, leading emperors such as Constantius to repeatedly devalue the currency. Taxation was also raised to try and address economic shortfalls, which put strain on the peasantry, further sowing seeds of discontent. Not to mention the brutal civil war waged under Constantius, which not only decimated the standing army, but also had its own grave economic costs, as well as loss of key European provinces to Germanic troops, which Constantius and Julian fought so hard to reclaim. Valentinian's reign was dominated by constant military struggles in Europe against the Saxons. Alemanni, and others, as well as trouble in Rome's British possessions with a hostile alliance between the Picts and Scots. By this time, a picture emerges of Rome's European empire severely buckling under the pressure from tribal incursions. Valentinian would die while on campaign against these European tribal enemies. Apparently, while holding a meeting with a group of Germanic tribal envoys, he suffered a fatal stroke while losing his temper with the group. Aside from this military strife, Valentinian made sure to restore the path of Christianization begun under Constantine the Great, which it deviated somewhat under Emperor Julian and his short pagan restoration period. Along with his brother Valens, they also ensured the removal of any succession threat from their predecessor Jovian by the binding of his son Veronianus, likely by burning or complete removal of an eyeball. This illustrates the quite depraved nature of successionary conflict by this point in Rome's history. The seeking of power had almost no limits, and the more balanced days of the Republic seemed like a distant dream. Following Valentinian's death, his brother would continue to rule for a further 3 years alongside Valentinian's son, Gratian, who assumed his father's responsibilities in the Western Empire. Their co-rule would give way to Theodosius the Thirsty in 379 AD, who would be the last Roman emperor to have sole rule over both eastern and western portions. Why did the Persian Empire collapse? The Persian Empire is the name given to a series of dynasties that ruled Persia across its history. The core of these empires was centered in modern-day Iran. Today, we are going to talk about the first Persian Empire, and probably the most popular. When we hear Persia, we think about the Greco-Persian Wars that happened 2,500 years ago. The stories of Marathon and of 300 Spartans are coming from these ancient events. The Achaemenid Empire, also known as Ancient Persia, ruled the lands of present-day Iran and expanded beyond across Levant to the Mediterranean Sea, conquering great ancient civilizations, including Babylonia or Egypt, having under their rule even the civilizations of Anatolia, reaching the shores of Europe, and at its maximum extent ruling over Thrace and northern Greece. Persia was the most powerful empire at the time. But why and how did this world power collapse? The first Persian Empire was founded by Cyrus the Great around 550 BC. It became one of the largest empires in history, stretching from Europe's Balkan Peninsula in the west to India's Indus Valley in the east. This Iron Age dynasty, sometimes called the Achaemenid Empire, was a global hub of culture, religion, science, art, and technology for more than 200 years before it fell to the invading armies of Alexander the Great. The Persian Empire started as a collection of semi-nomadic groups of people, tribes who raised sheep, goats, and cattle on the Iranian plateau. Cyrus the Great was the leader of one such tribe. And then he began to defeat nearby kingdoms and tribes. Some of them were Medea, Lydia, and Babylon, among others, joining them under one rule. The first Persian Empire under Cyrus the Great soon became the world's first superpower. Darius the Great, the fourth king of the Achaemenid Empire, ruled over the Persian Empire when it was at its largest, stretching from the Caucasus and West Asia to what was then Macedonia in the Balkans, the Black Sea, Central Asia, and even into Africa, including parts of Libya and Egypt. He unified the empire through introducing standard currency and weights and measures. Aramaic was the official language, even though the empire gathered many cultures. Roads and monuments were built. After the death of Darius, His son Xerxes ruled until 465 BC. Xerxes was a cruel but weak king, who was also defeated by the Greeks. During Xerxes's reign, the Persian Empire declined. It can be seen as the start of the downfall. Although the empire continued for more than a century, it grew weaker year by year, due to internal struggle and instability that followed, as it constantly faced conspiracies, assassinations, and revolts by the people, due to heavy taxes or other reason. As in other cases, the problem started from the interior. When an empire had stability, order, and balance in its internal affairs, its external ones were to be feared. At its greatest extent, it was larger than any previous empire in the known history of humanity. Consider to cover an area of 5.5 million square kilometers, incorporating various peoples from different origins and faiths. It had to be ruled carefully. A big giant is a powerful one, but may fall under its own weight. The Persians developed a clever system, notable for its successful model of a centralized, bureaucratic administration. It was divided into many regions, called satrapies, each region under the rule of a satrap, and every satrap was under the rule of the King of Kings. This was the title employed primarily by monarchs and rulers of the Middle East. In its early decades, the administration focused on building infrastructure such as road systems and a postal system, and also on the development of civil services and a large professional army. The empire's success inspired similar systems in later empires, but the social structure started to break down once there was no longer a strong leader. The emperor was the core, and being seen as a weak one could have attracted the attention of others in a fight for power. Firstly, the people below the upper class started organizing riots and other actions of revolt against the rulers. Kings became greedy and began stealing from the supply of riches rather than giving it to the people. Weak rulers led to many provincial revolts. One of them was Egypt. The civilization of the Nile had strong roots, and they always had detested Persian rule. Egypt was also a rich province of the empire, and its dissatisfaction will have impact when its people will choose not to fight Alexander the Great when he invaded Persia, but to welcome him as a liberator. Secondly, the provincial leaders. The satraps also became more independent on their lands, having more power there than the supreme ruler of the empire. They were seen more as local kings than as the king's loyal subjects. There were also conflicts between them. They even carried on their own foreign policies and waged war on each other, which only added to Persia's problems. Disunity of this gigantic structure led to these revolts, and disloyal satraps caused serious economic problems for the empire. The government definitely grew weaker in time and struggled with thriving without having a strong ruler that could train armies to battle and gain wealth for Persia. The government started to shift to a very dysfunctional dictatorship. The Persian army was negatively affected because they no longer had a strong base or leader to keep them in line. The costly defense of Persia's lands depleted the empire's funds, leading to heavier taxation among Persia's subjects. Persian taxes became heavier and more oppressive, which led to economic depression and revolts, which in turn led to more repression, heavier taxes, and so on. The Persian kings also started hoarding gold and silver rather than recirculating it. As a result of this economic turmoil, the Persian kings got weaker still, which fed back into the problem of revolts and powerful satraps and so on. Crop production decreased as well, which caused more commoners to leave and less trade to happen. They could no longer make scientific advancements. Persia decreased in complexity towards the end of its era. The decrease in these advancements caused their weapon production and safety to diminish. This was detrimental to the empire and was a major reason why it fell. Macedonia became a great Greek power under Philip II. Then he was assassinated by the captain of his bodyguard, Philip's son and previously designated heir. Alexander was proclaimed king by the Macedonian noblemen and army. Due to past Persian incursions on Greek lands, the Macedonians wanted revenge. In 334 BC, Alexander crossed the Hellespont into Asia, but the Persians decided to ignore the movement. Not considering the event as a real danger, the Persian king Darius III treated the situation with ignorance. Alexander defeated the Persian armies at Granicus, 334 BC, followed by Issus, 333 BC. Then he marched in Egypt, where he was welcomed as a liberator and considered a god by many men. At this point, Darius offered to Alexander half of its empire, but the young king rejected, believing that Asia was a gift to him received from the gods. After the major victory at Gaugamela, 331 BC, he marched on Susa and Persepolis, which surrendered in early 330 BC. From Persepolis, Alexander headed north to Pasargadae, where he visited the tomb of Cyrus. Darius III was taken prisoner by Bessus. Bessus had his man murder Darius III, and then declared himself Darius's successor as Artaxerxes V. But then he was found and put on trial in a Persian court and executed. Alexander the Great defeated King Darius III and the Persian army in 330 BC. Darius was subsequently assassinated by one of his own followers, although Alexander retained the Persian system of government until his own death in 323 BC. Darius's defeat marked the end of the Achaemenid dynasty and the Persian Empire. Alexander generally kept the original Achaemenid administrative structure, leaving some scholars to dub him as the last of the Achaemenids. Upon Alexander's death in 323 BC, his empire was divided among his generals. Why did the Ottoman Empire destroy itself? The 20th century for the Ottoman Empire was marked, or more accurately, scarred by one thing: collapse. Turkey's conquering power from the past 600 years would finally come to a humiliating end, with the whole world watching. The sick man of Europe would be unable to overcome the devastation brought by the Balkans' wars and events to follow. The first domino to fall was actually prior to the Balkan Wars and is known as the Young Turk Revolution. The Young Turks. Alongside other reformist groups making up the Committee of Union and Progress, was a movement established by groups of young university students in favor of once again establishing a constitutional monarchy, like the one that the Sultan Abdul Hamid II had established in 1876 and abolished 2 years later. As the Ottomans were pushed more and more into a defensive stance against the rest of Europe's powers, many of the Young Turks and other unionist reform supporters became further concerned with preserving their state. When the Anglo-Russian Convention of 1907 occurred, the Ottoman reformists felt that there was a potential for the diplomacy to extend into a partition of Ottoman-controlled Macedonia. Finally, in July of 1908, the revolution broke out. Led by unionists such as Major Ahmed Niazi, Ayub Sabri, and Ismail Enver, and began to put heavy pressure on the Sultan to end his absolute rule and reinstate the constitution. Given the amount of support within the Ottoman military and the weak state of Abdul Hamid's rule, The revolution ended on July 24th, with the Sultan capitulating and restoring a constitutional monarchy. The Ottoman government now underwent a significant change, and a general election took place in November of 1908. The Committee of Union and Progress, or CUP, had great success, and, as did many other former movements, established new political parties, such as the Freedom and Accord Party or the Ottoman Socialist Party. The new system was messy, and many of the incoming politicians were working-class people with no experience running a government. Meanwhile, Sultan Abdul Hamid II had been able to maintain his title under the terms that his position was basically only symbolic. Matters were complicated in 1909, though, when the Sultan stirred up the Ottoman counter-coup with his promises to restore the Ottoman Caliphate and Sharia legal system if his autocratic power was restored. Despite the fair amount of support, the counter-coup was quickly quelled after a short stint of control in Istanbul from Sultan Abdul Hamid's supporters. The Young Turk government was restored, and the Sultan was ultimately deposed and replaced by Mehmed V in a purely symbolic role. As stability within the empire continued, conflict in the Balkans suddenly skyrocketed. The Christians of Macedonia, including Serbs, Bulgarians, Laks, and Greeks, in addition to the Albanians, were heavily dissatisfied with the neglect they felt that they had received from the new Ottoman government, which was overly focused on centralized control. In 1912, the First Balkan War broke out with a declaration of war on Turkey by Montenegro on October 8th. The contestants of the conflict consisted of the Balkan League on one side, made up of Serbia, Bulgaria, Montenegro, and Greece, against the weakened Ottoman Empire. While Russia was not directly involved in the discord, they did give their favor to the Balkan League, which aimed to seize Macedonia from the Ottomans with their 750,000-strong army. The struggle was really only such for the Ottomans, as the Balkan coalition utterly routed their opponent on every front. All while the Balkan conflict carried on, the Ottomans were actually also locked into the Italo-Turkish War that started in 1911, after Italy demanded that the Turks give them territories in North Africa. The Ottomans refused, but Italy took the territories by force rather easily, stripping the Ottomans of some of their only remaining African possessions. Italy gained today's Libya and the Dodecanese Islands. The collapsing Ottoman Empire stood no chance against the allied Balkan powers, and by December 3rd, both sides were ready for an armistice. A brief revival of the conflict came after the coup in January of 1913, raiding the Sublime Porte and the government buildings and empowering the triumvirate of the three pashas. A peace treaty was finally signed in London 4 months later and officially stripped the Ottomans of almost every European territory they had left, including Albania, which would become independent, and Macedonia, which would be split between the Balkan nations. Although the Turks were not extensively involved in the Second Balkan War, which came as a consequence of disorder between Romania, Serbia, which came as a consequence of disorder between Romania, Serbia, Greece, and Bulgaria about the borders of their new Macedonian possessions. They did use the opportunity to retake Adrianople in a violation of their previous armistice with Bulgaria. In 1914, general elections now confirmed the CUP's authority, and the Ottoman imperial government was established in January of that year. Although going into the First World War, the three pashas would remain the de facto rulers of the new military regime in the empire. On October 28, 1914, the Ottoman Empire officially entered World War After signing the Turco-German alliance back in August of the same year, the friendly relations between Germany and Turkey played a significant role in the empire's entry into the war. In addition to Turkish opportunism and dislike of the Triple Entente nations, Germany had previously sent a military mission to Turkey, in which the Ottoman army and navy were organized under the leadership of Lehman von Sanders and greatly solidified the alliance between the involved authorities. The Germans also hoped that the Ottoman decision to join the side of the Triple Alliance would encourage Balkan states, such as Bulgaria, to support their cause as well. Meanwhile, the Turkish ambassador in Paris, Rifat Pasha, warned Enver Pasha, the Minister of War, not to join either side, as he believed that both alliances had the potential to shatter what little strength the empire had left. Enver Pasha, on the other hand, was unfazed and insisted that the early victories of Germany proved that they would be on the winning side of the war. The earliest military action taken by the Ottomans during the First World War was an attack on Russia's Black Sea coast that triggered a quick response and declaration of war from Russia, Great Britain, and France. From there, the Ottoman Empire mostly fought within the Middle Eastern and Balkan theaters and achieved significant victories near the start of the war, such as that at the Battle of Gallipoli. As the Turks were busy fighting on the world stage, they also faced revolts and a growing uprising from the local Arab territories. The decline of the empire was put on fast forward, and they were now facing offensive attacks from every possible angle. Although Enver Pasha maintained a stance of triumph nonetheless, insisting that the Ottomans must remain in the war to assist their allies, going as far as claiming to have contributed to the Russian collapse and revolution in 1917. Still, when Bulgaria was forced into an armistice after a successful offensive by the Allies at the Macedonian front, the Ottomans were put in an impossible position without the Bulgarians' assistance. Subsequently, after multiple visits to their partners, the Ottomans' Grand Vizier, Talat Pasha, concluded that he and his ministry must resign in order to gain milder terms from the Triple Entente if the war-starting administration was no longer in control. Ahmed Izzet Pasha took the role of the Grand Vizier and quickly entered peace negotiations with the British, who were eager to come to terms with the Ottomans and exclude the French and Americans from any benefits it may bring about. The Armistice of Mudros was then signed on October 30th, 1918, ending Turkish involvement in the war. Unfortunately for the Ottoman Empire, the armistice not only failed to bring true peace, but it also marked the final leg of decline. With Enver Pasha's administration, himself included no longer in power, the government was an unstable mess. Violence began to break out as law and order broke down, and the Western Allies began to march into Constantinople, under the claim that they needed to restore harmony throughout Anatolia, given that the Armistice of Mudros had allowed for the Allied powers to invade if a need to restore order was present. There was not much that the feeble Ottoman authority could do to stop them. The occupation of Constantinople lasted until the Treaty of Sèvres was signed on August 10, 1920, which gave the European allies control over Turkey's finances, a limit on their military numbers, and a significant amount of territory loss for the Ottomans. The Ottoman Empire, which was soon to be abolished, had to relinquish all right to North Africa and Arab Asia, and the empire was partitioned between Greece, Armenia, France, Italy, and Britain. To complicate matters, though, the treaty was never ratified due to an increasing nationalist movement throughout Turkey, leading to the Turkish War of Independence and the creation of the Grand National Assembly, which fought on one side of the war against the Sultan and the Western Allies, with the additionally unstable Russia backing the Turkish nationalists in hopes of developing a new communist ally and keeping the rest of Europe distracted from their own chaos. The revolutionaries were able to conclude a series of peace talks, ending in the Treaty of Kars, the Armistice of Madana, and the ultimate destruction of the Ottoman Sultanate and the empire in its entirety. The final sultan, Mehmed VI, left for exile on November 17, 1922, officially ending the collapse of one of the world's largest and long-lived empires in history. Under Mustafa Kemal, Turkey managed to regain territories in Anatolia and become independent. The new Turkish government earned international recognition through the following Treaty of Lausanne in the summer of 1923, officially replacing the Ottoman Empire with the Republic of Turkey. The history of the Ottoman Empire is vast and more than interesting, starting even before the Sultanate itself, with the arrival of the Turkish tribes of Anatolia, the Battle of Manzikert, the creation of various sultanates, and then the start of the Ottoman dynasty. This empire that existed for 600 years dominated its neighbors, won battles and wars, expanded quickly and became a predator in this part of the world, achieving great success. But, as history has always shown us since the beginning of time, that every action has a reaction. Every day becomes night, and every empire has its downfall. As other empires before them, the Ottomans did write their final page of history. Why did the Maurya Empire collapse? The Indian subcontinent in the early centuries BC was a land of empires. Notably, the Indian Nanda Empire sprawled across the northern portion while butting up against the lands of the ambitious and unrelenting Alexander the Great, at least for the time being. Legend has it that the fate of the Nanda Empire was sealed a good time before its true collapse, by a man known as Chanukya, a teacher, philosopher, and generally a jack of all trades. Chanukya traveled to Kataliputra for his occupation, but at some point, while there, had a falling out with the emperor himself. Chanukya was deeply troubled by what occurred between himself and Dhanananda, and thus swore that as revenge, he would bring about the collapse of this empire entirely. And as crazy as this sounds, he wouldn't really be wrong. Having escaped Dhanananda and fled to Taxila, Chanukya stumbled upon a man by the name of Chandragupta Maurya. He and some other young men were playing a game, essentially of role-playing a battle, which piqued Chanukya's interest. Something that he saw in the boy gave him the impression that Chandragupta not only excelled at the game, but he may just excel at something quite similar in real life. As the might and influence of Alexander the Great began to fade, as would his life, Chandragupta, advised by none other than Chanukya, would start looking to take some of the territories the Macedonian was losing. By the time of Alexander's death in 323 BC, Maurya, with the vengeful Chanukya in his ear, was nearly ready to fill the power vacuum that would be left behind. The exact details of how Chanukya led Chandragupta to conquer the Nanda Empire aren't exactly clear, but what is certain is that it did happen. And by 321 BC, Chandragupta was the new ruler of the newfound Vimoria Empire. In his early years as emperor, Chandragupta continued to focus on the old territories of Alexander the Great. In the final years of the 4th century BC, the new emperor thus waged war against the remnants of Alexander's empire, aiming to capture some of the previously annexed satrapies and surrounding domains. By 303 BC, one of the Macedonians' generals and successors, Seleucus Nekator was forced to sign a peace treaty with Chandragupta as the Maurya Empire pressed outward. From there, the Indian leader aimed to not only conquer the lands of the Greeks, but furthermore to form diplomatic relations with those he didn't invade, something which he was quite successful at as well. Overall, Chandragupta Maurya was a good leader. He established a strong, centralized authority, gave his empire a reputation of being freedom-loving, and managed to build a large kingdom from scratch. But in 297 BC, the first ruler of the Maurya Empire decided to call it quits. For religious reasons, Chandragupta handed over the empire to his son, Bindusara. The latter, being only in his early 20s, would expand his father's empire down south all the way to modern-day Karnataka. During his reign, nearly all of India would become part of the Maurya Empire, marking an impressive first for the subcontinent. Aside from back-to-back revolts in Taxila, Bindusara doesn't seem to have faced many challenges during his time as emperor either, although his life was not very well documented in general. His life would also end at some point during the 270s BC, at which point it's believed that a battle for succession followed for a few years. As Bindusara's son duked it out for the throne, a victor would finally emerge, and that victor would be the now famous Ashoka. The empire would stabilize and find its new leader in the form of Ashoka around 270 BC. And thus the most stunning period of Maurya history began. At first, he was viewed with heavy skepticism, having shown his ability to be cruel when it came to the war against his own brothers. Many found their new leader to be a serious concern. But Ashoka couldn't be bothered, as he was much too busy with a goal that, so far, the Maurya had failed to achieve, annexing the territory of Kalinga. As the 260s BC came to a close, spectacularly, Ashoka managed to do just that. However, in a surprising turn of events, the emperor began to feel deep remorse for what he had done. Roughly 100,000 men, including civilians, lost their lives in his war for Kalinga, and tens of thousands more were displaced or otherwise affected. As the guilt began to weigh on the ruler, he started to turn toward Buddhism for answers. Policies and functions of the empire would soon reflect this, and Ashoka himself put his feelings into words, which would then become edicts essentially plastered all throughout the empire. This new shift in emotions and faith not only proved to be an integral part of the spread of Buddhism, but it also marked a period of non-violence and subsequently no new expansion. When Ashoka died in 232 BC, none of his sons were able to take over the throne. One had died, another was blind, a third we don't much know about, and another was busy spreading their shared religion. This resulted in Ashoka's grandson, Dasaratha, succeeding him instead. Dasaratha was not a horrible ruler, but he wasn't necessarily a powerful one either. Under Ashoka's grandson, many of the territories previously conquered by the Maurya were lost, and this is generally viewed as the early decline of the empire. However, Dashrut would eventually be succeeded by his cousin, Samprati, who managed to regain the lost lands and temporarily restabilize the empire. The Mauryas, in the long run, couldn't maintain anything that Samprati had done nevertheless. Instead, Samprati's son and successor, Shalashuka, would begin a string of markedly weak rulers, himself being described as quarrelsome and unrighteous by the Yuga Purana. Shalashuka would then be followed by Deva Varman, who ruled until 195 BC and may have been more impressive than his predecessor, but still failed to hold the empire to the standards of Ashoka and all those before him. And to be fair, neither could his own successor, Shatadhanavan. The latter ruled from 195 BC to 187 BC, and would be the final monarch before the one who would end it all. Brihadratha Moira was the last emperor of the Moira Empire. At some time during the 180s BC, Brihadratha, the last of the emperors, is believed to have been attending a military parade led by one of his top generals, Pushyamitra Shunga. Hitho was not a reliable nor loyal general, and his parade was meant to display his might and authority to his supposed ruler. During the festivities, he assassinated Emperor Brihadratha Maurya in one motion, bringing about the sudden and heavy fall Ratha Maurya in one motion, bringing about the sudden and heavy fall of the Moira Empire. The end of Brihadratha's reign, and the empire as a whole, would be followed by the establishment of Pushyamitra's Shunga Empire. Unfortunately, due to the time period and circumstances of the empire's existence, we can't know much for certain. However, there are some clear contributing factors that would have ultimately led to the Maurya downfall. For one, Ashoka, though an icon and hero to many, was not a conqueror in his later years. Despite being an impressive one at the start of his reign, his unwillingness to do much through warfare undeniably paused any expansion until his death. But then again, while expansion worked for some empires, maybe it wouldn't have for the Mauryas. The idea that the empire was already too vast to strongly maintain is a valid theory, though that would still depend on who was at the helm of the imperial dynasty. And after Ashoka, the leaders were particularly the issue. His sons weren't even able to take the throne. And his grandsons were not as exceptional as himself nor his own predecessors. Still, foreign invaders, specifically the Greeks, did their own damage to the empire after Ashoka's death, which only made a hard job harder for weak rulers. And with all of this combined, in addition to the level of autonomy that some of the provinces within the empire had, it's no surprise that internal strife and rebellions began to pop up. These, predictably, were not easily crushed by incapable leaders, and thus the pressure was building as the Maurya Empire's collapse neared. At the end of the day, it's hard to pin the fall on one or even just two things. The simplest way to put it, however, would likely be the fact that, after Ashoka, the empire was plagued with weak and poor leadership. Why did the Second Bulgarian Empire collapse? Some point to the beginning of the end of the Second Bulgarian Empire was the reign of the child king. Kaliman Tupt. Being only a child himself, his regent or regents were tasked with running the empire for him until he could come of age. The regency was arguably weak, choosing to pay tribute to the belligerent Mongols as opposed to fighting them off and risking an ongoing war. This coupled with building internal strife as Bulgarian nobility saw growing cracks and schisms cause the foundation of the empire to begin to crumble. The boy king died before his 13th birthday, shifting power to the hands of Michael Azin, although technically he too was managed by a regent, as he was also a child. A short decade later, Kaliman Azin II would usurp the throne, which he would ultimately lose almost immediately to Mithsoazin after Kaliman was murdered. And this instability on the throne would become a regular occurrence. Bulgaria was weak, and it was no secret to those watching from home or abroad. Their enemies in the Nicene Empire and Hungary began chiseling away at Bulgaria's lands, mostly unstopped. This marked the peak of a landslide into power struggles and domestic conflict, ultimately leading to the reign of Constantine Tik as Emperor of Bulgaria. Constantine would have to face threats from the Byzantines, Hungarians, unsatisfied nobility and pretenders to his throne. Crippled by an accident and growing weary from constant troubles, the emperor now had to deal with an outright rebellion when 1277 brought about a large-scale peasant revolt, following the lead of a man by the name of Ivailo, a man who in the subsequent violence murdered Emperor Constantine. This left the Bulgarian Empire at the center of a vicious tug-of-war between Ivailo and the Byzantines. When Ivailo reached the capital of Tarnovo and was declared emperor, the Byzantines looked for Mongol aid in bringing about his demise, which would only come to fruition after a fatiguing back and forth. Ivailo was assassinated by the Mongols, and the Bulgarian nobility elected his successor, George I Tartar. This would fail to stabilize the stalling empire. Theodore Svetoslav, at the start of the 14th century, would give stability his best shot, finally putting an end to the Mongol raids and strengthening Bulgaria's borders, even managing to push back against Byzantine ploys to oust him and worsen the pre-existing instability. Peace was made between Bulgaria and the surrounding nations, and it seems that maybe the foundations have been restored, though this sigh of relief would only be temporary. Theodore's successors would return Bulgaria to its state of off-and-on warfare with the surrounding nations, particularly with the Byzantines and Serbians. These, however, nor Hungary, would be the final foe to take down the Second Bulgarian Empire. It would be the Ottomans who planted the kiss of death. The mid-14th century saw the reigning Bulgarian emperor attempt to halt an Ottoman invasion to no avail. He, Ivan Alexander, would struggle to regain lands from the Byzantines at the same time, but it was too late to save his empire. His 1371 death left Bulgaria a shattered ruin, best described in the words of Johann Schildberger. "I was in 3 regions, and all 3 were called Bulgaria. The first Bulgaria extends there, where you pass from Hungary through the Iron Gate. Its capital is called Vidin. The other Bulgaria lies opposite Wallachia, and its capital is called Tarnovo. The third Bulgaria is there, where the Danube flows into the sea. Its capital is called Kaliakra." Vidin was in the hands of Ivan Stratosmir. Ivan Shishman oversaw Tarnovo, and the rest fell to Davruchima. With Bulgaria divided and weak, the Ottomans ramped up their efforts of expansion and eyed the whole of Bulgaria with an unstoppable greed. Ivan Shishman hoped to put a final stop to the Ottoman incursions, and in 1371 agreed to become a vassal. A tense peace was thus made. But a decade later, the Ottoman thirst for expansion was still aching to be quenched. The 1380s thus saw the reignition of Ottoman attacks on Bulgarian soil. All the while, Ivan Shishman and his army were preoccupied, locked in a war against the nearby Wallachians and an uneasy rivalry with Ivan Stratosmir in Vidin. Ottoman attacks were growing harsher, and it seems the world was folding in on what little remained of the Second Bulgarian Empire. Tarnovo would fall to the invaders in 1393, Shishman would die in 1395, Vodin would follow suit in 1396. This is generally viewed as the official end of the Second Bulgarian Empire. The following century would see waning resistance attempts by the likes of Prusin and Constantine, but it was too late now. Bulgaria would not regain independence until the 20th century. So how exactly did the Second Bulgarian Empire collapse? What made it such an easy target for Ottoman conquest? Why was it so weak? From the very start, the Bulgarian Empire was not destined for any anticipated greatness. It was already the second attempt at creating and maintaining such a state. And the Byzantine Empire had been meddling in Bulgarian affairs for some time. The First Bulgarian Empire had been on a decline due to exterior threats, turned attacks, and overzealous expansionist dreams of the Emperor Simeon. The imperial state was stretched thin and facing beatings from Magyars, the Byzantines and the Rus, including, as to be expected in a failing empire, internal discord. Its ultimate demise came at the hands of what would be one of the Second Bulgarian Empire's Achilles' heels as well, the Byzantine Empire. The remaining territory of the First Bulgarian Empire would be annexed by the Byzantines in the early 11th century and would remain in Constantinople's tight grip until the late 12th century. A revolution by two brothers, Ivan and Peter Azen, would expel their Byzantine puppet masters and strong-arm the emperor into recognizing Bulgarian independence and the formation of their own empire. This is what brought about round two before the Bulgarians would eventually once again fall to a more powerful neighbor. Despite at one point being a Balkan power figure during the 13th century, the Second Bulgarian Empire was in a race downhill from day one. For some time, it seems that the new Bulgarian state couldn't even settle on its own religion. With the empire shifting between the Latin and Eastern churches for who would hold supremacy over Bulgarian ecclesiastical affairs, Rome or Constantinople. Although it is generally believed that in spite of political motives and decisions, the Bulgarians either way remained predominantly Orthodox Christians. It wasn't until the rule of Ivan II during the early to mid-13th century that the Second Bulgarian Empire, based in Tarnovo, became a Balkan superpower. This, however, was short-lived. Weak monarchs led to feuding nobility, which opened the door for foreign assaults. The latter came predominantly at the hands of the Mongols, the Byzantines, and, at the bitter end, the Ottomans. The Hungarians and Serbs would additionally beat down the Bulgarian door as the empire was more or less surrounded by hostile players. Such was the way of the times throughout Europe. But the Bulgarian Empire was particularly susceptible to the constant threats because of the insecurity within. The Bulgarian nobility was filled with rifts and contention, and it was a normal occurrence for one or more of the nobles from time to time to lay claim to the empire's throne, sometimes even with the support of outside menaces such as the Byzantines. Such a ploy wasn't hard to attempt, and it wasn't even hard to understand at times, considering the fact that the emperors were often weak. Children or otherwise failed to show the undeniable strength necessary to ward off such conspiracies. The ultimate downfall of the Second Bulgarian Empire was its inability to create a foundation strong enough to stand on. It was born in a wolf's den, and hoped to survive without the proper provisions. Instead, with every step, more of the floor crumbled, and the hungry wolves closed in around the withering state. Why did the Ayyubid Empire collapse? The Ayyubid dynasty of Egypt was a Sunni Muslim dynasty of Kurdish origin who rose to power in the 12th century, ruling over Egypt and a large part of the Middle East. The Ayyubids were a sultanate underneath the Abbasid Caliphate, touting a notable number of sultans in total by the end of their sovereignty in the 13th century. The first sultan, Saladin, was also the founder of the dynastic power. though his father. Ayyubub was responsible for giving the dynasty its name. It was Ayyub's work under the Seljuk Turks as governor of Damascus that set the stage for Saladin to eliminate the Fatimid dynasty. Before being proclaimed Sultan in 1174 and styling himself custodian of the two holy mosques. Though the Ayyubids' peak of power proved to be quite short. They did have success in creating a stronger Muslim presence, both in Egypt as well as in opposition to the Christian crusaders of Europe. The Sunni denomination of Islam grew in the regions ruled by the dynasty, mostly due to their dedicated erection of multiple madrasas, or schools of Islamic law. The economy under Ayyubid authority also flourished, even maintaining positive commercial relations with Europe, on top of the religious and economic impact. There was a level of importance put on education, as the Ayyubids themselves were highly educated people. The fields of science and medicine became widely valued, boasting experts in these studies, some of which who even personally served the Ayyubids. Architecture was also a key focal point under the dynasty, mainly in the form of religious and military structures, the latter being exemplified by the wall that was built surrounding Cairo and Alfastad, encompassing them together within one barrier, in spite of all the favorable and lucrative changes that the familial power provided. The Ayyubid dynasty was still unable to build a long-term empire. In part, this may have been caused by the lack of unity within the realm when it came to autonomy. The dynasty, after the reign of Saladin, became a predominantly semi-feudal structure, without a strong centralized government. Though this inner anatomy of the regime may have allowed for potential disloyalty and betrayals, there were more than just internal struggles. The ultimate downfall of the dynasty came from the outside. The beginning of the Ayyubid decline corresponded directly with the rise of the Mamluk Sultanate in Egypt and followed the Seventh Crusade. Having sent a fleet of 800 ships to Cyprus, the Crusaders' commander, Louis IX, aimed to gain aid from the Mongols in order to increase his chances of conquering Egypt. The Mongols proved unresponsive, so Louis led his troops onto Damietta without further support. The current Ayyubid Sultan al-Shali made a hasty return to Egypt, coming from Syria and bypassing Damietta, making his way to Mansoura, where he organized a defensive force to fight the Crusaders. Though the Sultan fell ill as the conflict persisted against the Christians, his wife, Shajar al-Dur, became commander-in-chief of his troops and was successful in repelling the Crusaders, ultimately leading to the arrest of King Louis and his men. Sultan al-Shali passed away during the height of the crusade, shifting the dynasty's control over to his son, Al-Muazzam Turan Shah, who would soon make an outright destructive mistake. Despite his father's Mamluk generals having played a crucial role in their success against the Christian offensive, Turan Shah chose to detach from the Mamluks, prompting a revolt against the new sultan that led to his assassination in 1250. Of 50, one of Sultan al-Shali's former Bari Mamluk generals, Izz al-Din Aybak, then married Shajar al-Dur, taking over control of the authority in Egypt on behalf of the newly crowned Sultan al-Asraf II. As the Mamluk ascension occurred in Egypt, Ayyubid control in Syria was also starting to fall apart. Having heard about Sultan Turan's death, Al-Nasir Yusuf attempted successfully to gather support from every Syria-based Ayyubid emir and make an advance against the Mamluk power in Egypt. At the end of 1250, Yusuf orchestrated an assault against Egypt, flaunting his higher-numbered and better-equipped army over the forces of Izz al-Din Aybak. Stunningly, regardless of advantage, Yusuf and his troops were soundly defeated and had no choice but to return to Syria shortly after. In March of 1252, an alliance was formed between the Crusaders and Mamluks, finally intent on instigating a war with the Ayyubids in Syria. However, before the conflict could escalate very far, the opposing Muslim authorities concluded that such a war would only benefit the Crusader side. By the end of the spring season in 1253, an agreement had been made, confirming Mamluk control over Egypt and most of Palestine, whereas the Ayyubids gained decisive dominion in Syria, while the treaty would need to be reformed. After discord between the powers arose once again, this settlement marked the end of the Ayyubid dynastic power in Egypt. Peace between the dynasties of Syria and Egypt lasted for more than a year, but as with most things, the harmony was only temporary. On the Ayyubid front, An-Nasir Yusuf began preparing for future strife with his supposed allies by sending 2 envoys to the Abbasids in Baghdad with the goal of requesting an official induction as Sultan under the assumption that such a title would be beneficial in the event of upcoming dissension between the Muslim dynasties. This plea proved controversial, as the Mamluk leader had apparently already sent his own envoys to Baghdad, specifically urging the caliph to hold back from granting the title to the Ayyubid ruler if ever desired it. As new tensions grew, a conspiracy emerged in 1257 that left Izz al-Din Aybak dead, placing his 15-year-old son al-Mansur Ali on the Mamluk throne and prompting another rumored plot. This new scheme was allegedly tied to al-Nasir Yusuf, as well as al-Mansur Ali's vizier, causing the latter to be executed as a result. Yusuf now faced pressure from the Mamluks of Syria, who wished for him to step in and invade Egypt, but worried that they would betray him if Egypt was to be conquered. He refused. This triggered a major strain between Yusuf and the local Mamluks, who, in the fall of 1257, suddenly moved from Damascus to the more southern city of Jerusalem. Ruh al-Din Babar, a former general and leader of the current Mamluk population in Syria, subsequently disposed of the governor of Jerusalem after he declined a request to support a campaign against Nasir Yusuf, not stopping there. Baybars went on to seize Gaza and consequently incited a response from Yusuf, whose forces quickly pushed the Bari Mamluks into submission, changing objectives. Baybar later decided to make an advance towards Egypt, though his efforts were ultimately stomped out. With the interfactions of the Middle East already at great odds, the Ayyubid dynasty faced yet another crippling threat in the form of the Mongols, having been ordered by his brother to expand their empire further. Hulagu gathered his army and assailed Baghdad in 1258, murdering the Caliph al-Mustasim in the process. The Ayyubids were unable to defend the city or its inhabitants. When negotiation attempts with Hulagu failed, Yusuf was forced to continue his endeavors to defend other Ayyubid territories. Even so, in 1260, the Mongols successfully laid siege to Aleppo, demolishing the Great Mosque and the citadel of Aleppo as part of their conquest. At this point, fear of the Mongols began to plant seeds of betrayal amongst the Ayyubid emirs, some of which eventually chose to switch sides and align with the invaders in exchange for maintaining authority over their city. Al-Nasir Yusuf at last decided to flee for Gaza, leaving Damascus just before the city surrendered to the approaching Mongol army. Surprisingly, The Mongols opted not to sack Damascus, as they had done with the previous cities they had seized, leaving the citadel of Damascus and a small garrison left behind by Yusuf intact, remotely organizing a revolt from Gaza. Yusuf convicted the men to confront the invaders, but the venture fundamentally failed. Evoking a surrender from the garrison, the Mongols resumed their campaign, one by one annexing more cities and eventually capturing an-Nasir Yusuf himself, conclusively ridding the region of all Ayyubid influence. In September of 1260, the Mamluks of Egypt launched their own assault on the Mongols and won the pivotal battle of Ain Jalut, allowing for the capture of most of Syria in only a few weeks, briskly taking primary control in the Middle East. While almost all of the Ayyubid emirs in Syria also lost their authority, Al-Mansur of Hama was an exception on account of his actions. Fighting for the Mamluk side during their campaign, in accordance with this, Hama remained under the rule of Ayyubid lineage until 1299, at which point it fell to the Mamluk dominion, until being placed back in the hands of an Ayyubid descendant by the contemporary Mamluk Sultan al-Nasir Muhammad. When Abu al-Fida, the new ruler of Hama, passed away in 1331, his son al-Afdal Muhammad succeeded him, but only for a short decade. Al-Afdal Muhammad was ousted from his position in 1341, returning Hama completely to the Mamluks. The only remaining sign of a Ubud dynasty power existed solely in southeastern Anatolia. The only remaining sign of a Ubud dynasty power existed solely in southeastern Anatolia, where lingering shreds of the dynasty reigned over the principality of his Khalifa as an independent institution